Well, hello. My name's Patricia, and I'd like to welcome you to the Poetry Pcast, where it's time for a bit more Tanka poetry. Because if you're listening to this in real time, the beginning of November 2024, submissions are open for Tanka. Your deadline is the 15th of November. Check out the show notes for the criteria. Now, many of our haiku community have said that they're a bit wary of writing Tanka because they've not tried it before. And I have this to say. There will be many of you in the same boat. Give it a go. You might just find that you've found the new love of your writing life. And you know, here at Pete Towers, the editing team often find that relative novices writing haiku are successful. And it's because, I think, they're coming to the form with fresh eyes. I'd like to see if that's the case with Tanka too. Lastly, and please feel free to contradict me, but I feel that Tanka are closer to Western forms of poetry that many of us grew up with than haiku are. So maybe we're going to have a natural affinity for them. Send your thoughts in an email, please. So the last Tanka podcast I brought you was a joint production from myself and Vandana Parashar, episode 41 of this series. Link in the show notes, of course. Anyway, in that episode, we brought you contemporary Tanka. And in episodes 36 and 37, I gave you an historical viewpoint from Waka to Tanka. And there's an essay to go with it, which you'll find at Buy Me a Coffee. And of course, there'll be a link in the show notes to make that easy if you want to have a read. For episode 37, I read an anthology of Tanka that was put together by Makoto Ueda, which was published in 1996. In that anthology, he features 20 poets, but only 5 of them, just 1/4, were Tanka written by women. He said his criteria for choosing the poets was to illustrate the major styles that had been used in the 100 years prior to the publication of the anthology. Now, my knowledge of modern Japanese Tanka is not yet at the point where I can, as he suggests, compile my own anthology of Japanese Tanka. Perhaps in the coming years, that will be remedied. But his research did set me thinking. Why were so few women featured? So my plan was to take a little ramble through some Tanka by female poets, some featured by Ueda, some not, and do some research into what was going on during the period Ueda was researching. Well, that was the plan. But then I got reading about Yosano Akiko, and the plan changed. So at this point of time, the new plan is an episode all about Yosano Akiko, a separate episode about female poets, whether featured by Ueda or not, and then an episode about a rather interesting, more contemporary Tanka poet, Tawara Machi. I'm excited. I hope you'll enjoy it. The first of the women featured in Ueda's anthology is Yosano Akiko. She began her writing career towards the end of the 19th century. You know, she's a fascinating and complex character, like most of us, really. In her case, she was eventually married to Yasano Tekan, who was the editor of the magazine Myojo, Morning Star. But their relationship got off to a bit of a scandalous start. Akiko ran away from her somewhat conservative family near Osaka to live with Tekan, who already had a common law wife with whom he had a child, and there was another woman involved in their romance, a proper ménage à trois. Or quatre, I suppose. Anyway, I'll talk about that other woman, but mostly in the next podcast. Shortly before the Yosanos married, Akiko had her first collection of Tanka, Midaregami, or Tangled Hair, published. And if you recall, in episode 37, I took you through some of the stars of Tanka in the post-reform period, and according to Ueda, and many others, Akiko wrote the Tanka of Tangled Hair in the style of the Romantics. In fact, Janine Beichman, in her book Embrace the Firebird, which is all about Akiko, says that this book, i.e. Tangled Hair, was the supreme example of Romantics in Japanese poetry of the time. And to kick off the poetry today, I'm going to give you a couple of examples from Tangled Hair. Coming by the shore, please, herdsman, sing a song. The lake in autumn is much too lonely. Coming by the shore, please, herdsman, sing a song. The lake in autumn is much too lonely. Yosano Akiko, translated by Jane Reichold and Makiko Kobayashi. And there'll be an essay to go with this series of podcasts on Tanka, and you'll find all the publications cited in it. Farewell, my love. For 2 nights of Awata's spring I was your wife, and now until the world to come, I command you, forget me. Farewell, my love. For 2 nights of Awata's spring I was your wife, and now until the world to come, I command you, forget me. Yosano Akiko, translated by Janine Beichman. For the most part, this collection, Tangled Hair, is seen as her best work. In the 1970s, Yoshida Saiichi, a scholar of modern Japanese literature, proposed that Akiko was a romantic-style poet whose central subject matter was love, and who therefore wrote all her best poetry in youth. Many of her contemporary critics, mostly men, felt that she would not have been as prolific a poet were it not for her husband, Yosano Akiko. Which might be true, actually, thinking about it, but not for the reasons that they were thinking. Anyway, if I remember, I'll tell you why. Saito Mikichi, a highly regarded Tanka poet, spoke dismissively of her work, saying that she wrote exactly what came into her mind, and that a woman's literary work never amounts to much. Outrageous by today's standards. But if we take those comments in context, then we probably shouldn't be surprised. Akiko's work, both poetry and essays, were widely published in Saito, or Blue Stocking, a literary magazine created by women alone as an outlet for their art. One of its prime movers, Hirasuka Raicho, wrote this in September 1911. And it might give us a clue as to the thoughts of the literary world in Japan around that time. In the beginning, woman was the sun, an authentic person. Today she is the moon, living through others, reflecting the brilliance of others. And now Blue Stocking, a journal created for the first time with the brains and the hand of today's Japanese women, raises its voice. Raicho claimed not to be aware of the international feminist movement, but it strikes me as no coincidence that this magazine's title mirrors the Blue Stocking movement, originating in England in the 1750s, and which over time came to be seen as a term describing learned women in general. It's fair to say that Akiko was a feminist poet. Yes, she did write of love, but she was not afraid as a woman of a certain era to speak out on things that mattered to her. War and feminism, for example. She was a poet, she was an essayist, a traveller. You know, she traveled to Europe, meeting many artistic icons such as Rodin. and she co-founded a school for girls. And on top of that, she gave birth to 13 children, of which 11 survived. So she was a very, very busy woman. At the beginning of her career, she could have been seen as an adjunct to her husband, Tekan, but this was far from the truth. She was, in fact, more successful than him, and she kept the family from destitution with her literary work. And that's why I say that, they could have had a point. She was successful because of her husband, because she had to keep the household going. Anyway, that's a story for another day, I guess. But you can imagine why her success might have been a bone of contention between them. And she did admit after he died that they had been competitors in their work. Nonetheless, after his death, she wrote movingly about their relationship and how she missed him. Morning after morning, there is only myself to listen to the stories of the dreams in which I saw you. Morning after morning, there is only myself to listen to the stories of the dreams in which I saw you. Yosano Akiko, translated by Janine Weichman. And if you're watching this on the slides on YouTube, you'll see that she uses the word morning, or spells the word morning, morning, morning after morning. But if you're just listening to it, you could actually take it as morning, mourning, couldn't you? She's mourning and mourning, because there's only herself to listen to the stories of the dreams in which she sees her husband. White blossoms bloom on 1,000 branches in my grieving heart, despite the world outside laden with fresh greens and reds. White blossoms bloom on 1,000 branches in my grieving heart, despite the world outside laden with fresh greens and reds. Yosano Akiko, translated by Makoto Ueda. Now, I mentioned in passing that Akiko was a traveller. In 1911, she left for Paris, travelling alone via rail from Vladivostok. In Paris, she met up with her husband and, as I mentioned, other luminaries. But imagine what a journey that must have been, and so brave of her, travelling that distance on her own. Of course, her travels inspired more poetry. She picks poppies, then scatters them over the stone table. Suddenly my heart grows cold. Has blood spilled? She picks poppies, then scatters them over the stone table. Suddenly my heart grows cold. Has blood spilled? Yosano Akiko, translated by Janine Weichman. Now, this poem can be enjoyed at face value. It's very vivid, isn't it? But when you know that the person picking and scattering the flowers is a rather attractive teenage girl for whom Akiko's husband has professed attraction, and as we know, he's got a bit of a history, the poem takes on a fresh outlook. Listen again. She picks poppies, then scatters them over the stone table. Suddenly my heart grows cold. Has blood spilled? Once she got to Europe, Akiko was in the company of her husband, Yukan, but her children were left at home. And in this Tanka, written on 3 lines, and we haven't touched on that yet. We'll do that maybe next year. But this Tanka is part of a sequence written in her poem diary entitled The Channel Boat. Punishment came amid lover's passion, apart from the children. I wander the sea. Punishment came amid love's passion, apart from the children. I wander the sea. Yosano Akiko, translated by Janine Weichman. I mentioned earlier that she'd given birth to 13 children, and I came across a Tanka while doing the research that as one mum to another, I found resonated with me. It was written after the birth of one of her daughters, a twin. The other twin, unfortunately, was stillborn. But for women writhing like vengeful demons, screaming like wild boars, no child of man would ever be born. But for women writhing like vengeful demons, screaming like wild boars, no child of man would ever be born. Yosano Akiko, translated by Makoto Ueda. Now, let's turn to the topic of war, on which Akiko has a bit of a complicated history. Initially, her writing on war was seen as somewhat traitorous, because she wrote a poem for her younger brother who was being sent to war against the Russians. She wrote it in 1904. Here's a bit of it. I cry for you, brother. Don't you dare lay down your life. You, the youngest child in our family, thus cherished all the more. Mother and father didn't educate you to wield weapons and to murder. They didn't bring you up to the age of 24 so that you could kill or be killed yourself. I cry for you, brother. Don't you dare lay down your life. You, the youngest child in our family, thus cherished all the more. Mother and father didn't educate you to wield weapons and to murder. They didn't bring you up to the age of 24 so that you could kill or be killed yourself. It's a much longer poem, and you can Google it and read it all yourself if you wanted to. But it's by Yosano Akiko, and this time translated by Arthur Binnard. I would say at this point in her life, quite young herself, she's definitely anti-war. But then in 1928, during a period that Japan was trying to secure influence throughout the region of Manchuria, which is in the northeast of China, Akiko was traveling again, this time in Manchuria. And she was there when the Japanese army assassinated the generalissimo of the military government of China in the area, Zhang Zuolin. The Japanese blew up his train, and as far as I can tell, blamed it on the local forces, hoping to provoke civil unrest in Manchuria, which would lead to Japanese intervention and potentially the area being annexed by Japan, which would be good for Japan because I believe they were quite interested in having the natural resources of the region. Anyway, so Akiko was staying in a hotel close by the explosion. She heard it and didn't seem overly perturbed. I have a couple of Tanka, she wrote at the time. Inside the half-burned train are the white cards from the poker game the general was playing. Inside the half-burned train are the white cards from the poker game the general was playing. Yosano Akiko, translator unknown. Tangshan, with fields of green. Do not worry, good neighbor. You will not go to ruin. Tangshan, with fields of green. Do not worry, good neighbor. You will not go to ruin. Yosano Akiko. Again, I don't know the translator for this one. But this second poem seems to suggest that the local forces will not feel the wrath of the Japanese. Instead, perhaps she's suggesting that they'll be protected by them. What do you think? Historically, hostilities continued through the 30s, and in 1932, Akiko was writing again about war, this time about the fighting between the Chinese and Japanese around Shanghai. In her poem, Citizens of Japan, a Morning Song, she wrote in praise of a young Japanese man who gave up his life in a suicide mission. Quite different in tone, isn't it, from the poem she wrote about her brother, who she was adamant shouldn't give up his life. Here's a little snippet from the poem, which illustrates just how her views have changed. Though his is the body of one soldier, carrying the canister of destruction, he dances through the barbed wire and transformed that body into powder. Though his is the body of one major, he expects no mercy from the enemy and scatters that body purer than a flower, giving life to the samurai's honor. Though his is the body of one soldier, carrying the canister of destruction, he dances through the barbed wire and transforms that body into powder. Though his is the body of one major, he expects no mercy from the enemy and scatters that body, purer than a flower, giving life to the samurai's honor. Yosano Akiko, translator unknown. The last war she would have written about, of course, was that in the Pacific. And her initial reaction to the outbreak of war was a little subdued, I think. Japan's Prime Minister and I, who am ill, cry the same tears over the august declaration of war. Japan's Prime Minister and I, who am ill, cry the same tears over the august declaration of war. Yosano Akiko, translator unknown. But subsequently, her poetry became a lot more supportive of the war, of the Japanese fighting forces, perhaps not surprisingly because she had at least one child in the armed forces. How strong! They fear not heaven nor feel shame on earth, our brave soldiers in battle. How strong! They fear not heaven nor feel shame on earth, our brave soldiers in battle. Yosano Akiko, translator unknown. Becoming a Navy lieutenant, my fourth son goes now to the sacred war. Fight bravely. Becoming a Navy lieutenant, my fourth son goes now to the sacred war. Fight bravely. Yosano Akiko, translator unknown. Definitely a very different tone to that she wrote about her brother back in 1904. But this must have been one of the last Tanka she wrote, as in 1942 she died of a stroke, leaving behind a huge volume of work. Yet it's the Tanka from her first published work, a work she published around the age of 22, that are still the poems, the work she is best known for, at least here in the West. That's Tangled Hair. And as I previously said, it was not universally critically acclaimed, but actually nobody can argue that it was not a success. It was republished 4 times in 5 years. The book is divided into 6 sections. And to close this week's podcast, I'm going to read you a poem from each. Enji Murasaki, or Carmine Purple. Colour of carmine, whom shall I tell of it? Surging of blood, yearning of springtime, life in full flower. Colour of carmine, whom shall I tell of it? Surging of blood, yearning of springtime, life in full flower. Yosano Akiko, translated by Edwin A. Cranston. Hasu no Hanafune, Lotus Flower Boat. Red flowers bloom, their name unknown on the field path. Don't hurry the one under a small umbrella. Red flowers bloom, their name unknown on the field path. Don't hurry the one under a small umbrella. Yosano Akiko, translated by Jane Reichold and Michiko Kobayashi. Shirayuri, or White Lily. White Lily was the nickname of Yamakawa Tomiko, the woman I talked about earlier. She was in love with Yosano Akiko, and possibly vice versa at the beginning of Akiko's relationship with him. Allegedly, she was also in a relationship with him. And imagine, the three of them were actually friends. At least at the point at which Akiko is writing. At night, moonlight, on the lotus by the railing. You're so beautiful, I never forget your poem written on top of a leaf. At night, moonlight, on the lotus by the railing. You're so beautiful, I never forget your poem written on top of a leaf. Yosano Akiko, translated by Jane Reichold and Michiko Kobayashi. Hatachi Zuma, 20-year-old wife. Sending to a lily a little butterfly from heaven, in pale blue the basting threads are removed by God. Sending to a lily a little butterfly from heaven, in pale blue the basting threads are removed by God. Yosano Akiko, translated by Jane Reichold and Michiko Kobayashi. I wonder as I read this whether it was a poem about being undressed by Yosano Akiko. Maihimi, dancing girl. A dancing girl, even while napping, she is beautiful. In a riverboat on a spring morning, going down to Kyoto. A dancing girl, even while napping, she is beautiful. In a riverboat on a spring morning, going down to Kyoto. Yosano Akiko, translated by Jane Reichold and Michiko Kobayashi. Shunshi, spring heart. The foggy light with its turbulence was an omen. When the light's gone, my God is beautiful. The foggy night with its turbulence was an omen. When the light's gone, my God is beautiful. Yosano Akiko, translated by Jane Reichold and Michiko Kobayashi. Well, I hope you agree. Yosano Akiko was a fascinating woman. As I read about her and read her work, I couldn't help but feel she was something of a free spirit, not afraid to give her opinions. And whether you approve of them or lean the other way, surely you can't help but admire what she achieved in her long career. So next time we'll hear a bit of poetry from her love rifle, Yamakawa Tomiko, and the female poets that Makoto Ueda chose to feature in his book, Modern Japanese Tanka, an Anthology, and perhaps some that he didn't. Do come along and join me, because hopefully these poems are going to inspire you to write your submission of Tanka this month, November 2024. That's if you need it. But come anyway. Don't miss our deadline. But if you have missed it, check out the submission diary on the website and see what we're up to. Now, as you can tell, I did quite a bit of research for this series of podcasts, and it took a while, and of course, there were costs involved. If you can help me with these costs, perhaps by becoming a member or by buying the podcast a coffee from time to time, or maybe as Christmas is coming, you can make a Christmas donation. Whatever you can do will be appreciated. There will come a point in time when I can't continue to do this without more of your help. If you can do this, links will be on the website. So do come back for some more Tanka next week. I'm really loving this poetic form. I hope you are too. And until next week, keep writing. Now, as I said to you before, when I finish this little run of podcasts on female Tanka poets, I will write an accompanying essay. You can keep checking the show notes for that, or you can make sure you're signed up to our mailing list and I'll let you know about it. All the citations for the work I've used today will be in it. Ciao.